I first became interested in philosophy, I was fascinated by the fact that it's really a lot like traveling. One of the things I enjoy about traveling is finding out where differences of custom happen. For example, when someone sits down to eat, do they pick up a knife and fork? Do they pick up chopsticks? What sorts of things do people eat with their hands? Sometimes these differences of custom create surprises, but indeed that's part of the adventure of traveling. I think the same is true of the philosophical tradition in all cultures. If you pick up a philosophical text, you have the opportunity to imaginatively travel to some other historical situation. What were the reasons people were asking these questions? What kind of answers are given here? How are they like the answers other people have given to similar questions? One of the things that's certainly the case about philosophical texts is that they do tend to treat the same questions over and over again. And I think that this is fundamental because, after all, human beings do have the same kinds of experiences, basically, and these experiences give rise to the same set of questions. For example, the very basic question of what are we? Because we're conscious, we reflect on ourselves, and we can ask ourselves, well, what does it mean to be a human being? Are we significantly different from animals? Are there beings elsewhere in the universe? Could they have any relationship to us? Are we related to God or gods? What else is there? A whole general question about how we're related to whatever else there is, however that's understood, gets raised repeatedly too. Should human beings view the world as theirs to do what they like with? Should human beings view themselves as a small part of nature? How should we interact with each other? Certainly that's a question that comes up in every society. There will always be personality conflicts among individuals, no matter what the society, and societies have to figure out some way of dealing with those. How do we relate to nature specifically on this planet? Do we have dominion over it? Are we part of it? Is it sensible to talk about man as opposed to nature? Human beings also ask the question of what their goals should be in life. We recognize that we're going to die eventually. What should we do while we're here? Should we have a single goal? Should we have multiple goals? Does everybody have the same goal? Is what's good for one person good for another? And in general, what else do I fill my life with? Besides just focusing on a goal, are there other things that are worthwhile? Is something like art something fundamental to human experience? Is it merely decorative? These kind of questions come up everywhere. And as we look back at human history, we find that these sort of reflections came up awfully early. Joseph Lyons suggests that we already see evidence of philosophical reflection in cave paintings that have been found around the world. He finds it particularly fascinating that oftentimes the paintings are put in parts of a cave that would be very hard to access. Not only would it be hard to access to see them, he marvels at the fact that anyone managed to get themselves into the position to paint them in the first place. And it occurs to him that this is, in some ways, a kind of mysterious thing. If it were mere decoration, like the way we might hang a picture on a wall, why go out of your way to put these pictures in such inaccessible places? His suggestion is that cave people already recognized that it was possible to distinguish our everyday world from some other order of reality. They may have gotten the idea for painting images of animals that are a different size from the size that animals actually are, just from their experience in the everyday world. If you think about human beings as hunters looking in the distance to see if there is any possible prey, obviously it's possible to think of seeing some animal at a distance looking much smaller than it actually is close up. And this may have been one of the reasons for fascination with the appearance of an animal. But the very fact that people have to go out of their way to get into this unusual position to see these pictures suggests to Lyons that actually there must have been a kind of fundamental sense of ordinary reality and a special particular reality in which these images take their place. A fundamental distinction we'll find in many societies is the idea that everyday reality and something either more fundamental or at least something different is part of human experience. The question of whether the way things appear and the way they really are is raised in many societies. Another topic that seems to occur to people very early is the fact of human mortality. The Great Pyramids are actually monumental tombs. In China, we find tremendous effort to give people in their death certain things that they can take with them into the next life, as you also find in Egypt. Obviously, there is speculation on the relationship between this life and a possible other life. Reflections on death, of course, lead to reflections on time. The fact that as we grow, we age and eventually die. Time seems to have been a concern of people, again, very early on. In Ireland, New Grange is a huge monumental grave. It's a mound that's supported by very elaborate rock work. And within it is a center grave that is very, very deep within this mound. You hardly see where you come from when you actually reach the center of it. Nevertheless, on the winter solstice, the sun rises and the light from the sun at that point illuminates this whole inner vault. Obviously, this was done with considerable design. And it suggests that people were very concerned about the movements of the heavenly bodies and how those might pertain to us, and how those might in some way relate to an afterlife, if there is such a thing. Stonehenge similarly has some of the rocks arranged to coordinate with where the sun and moon rise at the times of the solstices. But it's not only in the British Isles that you find this. Monte Alban in Mexico, an Olmec center, the Olmec people being a people that dominated in Mexico between 600 and 300 BCE. At Monte Alban, there are buildings that are designed to have particular architectural features coordinated with many astronomical experiences, not only in connection with the solstice, but also equinoxes, even important moments in the cycle of where Venus appears in the sky. Certainly, experience among human beings raises philosophical questions. And we see some of the earliest philosophers that are recorded trying to answer the basic question, how should people live? How should they get along with each other? The Persian philosopher Zarathustra, for example, suggested that his people needed to reassess how they were living. In particular, he thought it was important that they stop worshiping the same gods that some of their enemies did. Presumably, he believed that giving support to the enemy's gods was inadvertently giving support to the enemies as well. But he also specified a whole way of life. And this was indeed what philosophers early on in many traditions did. Moses, for example, gave a statement of a whole way of life to the Hebrew people. Now, indeed, in both cases, the way of life prescribed was in large part coordinated with the kind of life people were living already. But these early philosophers tried to systematize it, make it something that was coherent, a way of life that people could understand. The early authors of the Vedas, similarly, tried to articulate a way of life and spelled it out in great detail. And this was what philosophers seem to have done around the world for a considerable period of time. Interestingly, though, Karl Jaspers, a German philosopher, has argued that there seems to have been a moment in time where philosophers around the world started doing something a bit different. He calls this the axial period, and he describes this as the spiritual process that occurred between 800 and 200 BC. What he means by the axial period is that if you drive an axis through the globe, you'll find that people on both ends of it are doing roughly the same kind of thing. And he points to how many different philosophers in different parts of the world started doing what he considers to be a new agenda. Man becomes aware of being as a whole, he says, of himself and his limitations. He asks radical questions. The mythical age, with its tranquility and self-evidence, was at an end. Human beings dared to rely on themselves as individuals. Man proved capable of confronting inwardly the entire universe. He discovered within himself the origin from which to raise himself above his own self and the world. Being a Western thinker, Perhaps it's not surprising that Jaspers in that passage emphasizes the individual. And I think that one might suggest that if he had been writing from the point of view of another culture where the individual isn't maybe the dominant focus, perhaps he would have phrased it differently. But what he's getting at here is that suddenly, at this period in human history, thinkers around the globe began to challenge and criticize some things that were simply accepted by their societies as a whole. Confucius, for example, although he attempted to restore certain traditions, criticized his society for accepting certain decline in leadership. He lived in a war-torn period, and he was concerned about how to restore social stability. And his suggestion was to do this by means of social ritual, a common vocabulary of tradition. Lao Tzu, another Chinese thinker from approximately the same period, had a different approach to how people ought to live. He was concerned that people got too involved in some of the habits that they developed just over the course of constructing their institutions. And his suggestion is that it's important to step back from these institutions, to step back from our categories, and think about ourselves in a natural way. Return to nature, return to a recognition of ourselves. Like him, the Taoist Zhuangzi similarly suggests that people had become too preoccupied in their expectations, in their desire for external importance, and had lost sight of what really mattered. The Buddha, the Indian prince Siddhartha Gautama, also proposed a new way of life on the basis of criticizing certain things about his society. The Buddha was very concerned about human suffering, and what he suggested was that people suddenly focus on that, pay attention to the fact of human suffering and the fact that it could be cured. He believed that the way of life that most people had adopted was not focused on the right thing. So directing attention to what he considered to be the fundamental agenda was what he considered important. The Hebrew prophets, such as Elijah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, were also critical of their society. They suggested that certain things that had been happening, that had been hardships for their people, were really a reflection of a declining relationship that the people had with God. So again, although there's a sense that this is a continuity with tradition, because there is a sense of going back to something that's important and been lost sight of, nevertheless they're suggesting a new agenda. Let's get back to what's really fundamental, the relationship of the Hebrew people with God. Ancient Greek thinkers questioned appearances. They believed that although appearances are what most people take for granted, that actually there is some underlying explanation behind them. And they offered many different explanations for what that explanation might be. Parmenides, for example, claimed that appearances lead us to believe that change exists, but really only being, something that doesn't become, is fundamentally real. Heraclitus offered just the opposite way of diagnosing the situation. What we're mistaken about most of the time is the idea that there are stable things that endure. From his point of view, what's fundamental is change, and the idea that there are stable things and beings is what's a mistake. But in talking about ancient Greek thought, the thinker that comes to mind most primarily is Socrates. Socrates loved questioning people and challenging their assumptions. He seems to be quite convinced, in all the dialogues in which we read about him, that people generally believed a lot of things on the basis of no foundation whatsoever. So he takes great satisfaction, it appears, in pointing this out to people. Often he does this by initially pretending to take seriously some claim that they've made. For example, in one dialogue written by Plato, a student of Socrates, Socrates accosts a man who claims that he's going to court and actually suing his father. And Socrates is rather taken aback by this, but says, well, that's amazing. What are you suing him about? And the man claims that his father is impious. He's guilty of the sin of not reflecting piety, not treating the gods with appropriate respect. Socrates asks him, well, gee, if that's the case, then are you an authority on piety? And unfortunately for Euthyphro, he basically takes the bait and acts as though he is. Socrates proceeds to question him, making it obvious to Euthyphro, as well as to everyone reading the dialogue, that Euthyphro has no idea what he's talking about. He has all kinds of assumptions that he's gotten from somewhere. He believes them mainly because he thinks other people do, but they don't even hang together with each other. They're completely inconsistent. This is what Socrates does recurrently in the dialogues of Plato. I should mention that Plato is one of the main sources through which we know Socrates. Socrates was this challenger of tradition, but nevertheless didn't write anything himself, so we only know him secondhand. And the main source of our knowledge of Socrates is Plato, his student, another of these really important philosophers of the axial period. Plato uses Socrates as his spokesperson in most of the dialogues, but I think most scholars think that initially Plato was writing dialogues that were fairly faithful to the way Socrates actually was, but that over time he had the Socrates of the dialogue speak more and more his own thoughts. Plato suggested a radical transformation of the way people understood everyday reality. His suggestion was appearances would lead us to believe that the world as we see it is real, but it's a really pale copy of a truer realm. So his suggestion was that appearances in general should be distrusted. Now, interestingly, he agrees with Parmenides that one of the things that's untrustworthy about appearances is the fact that we see all this change happening. According to Plato, what was really real is eternal. Eternity, the unchanging, is what's really of value. And what we see here are various reflections of these truer realities. So again, to kind of go back to the point made about the cave paintings before, there's a very strong sense that there's another realm that's quite different in certain respects from the realm of appearances, though they have some relationship to each other. Besides the axial period that Jaspers mentions, I think we can talk about many other turning points in philosophical history. Certainly in the West, the founding of Christianity and of Islam are important turning points. I think this is a good moment to point out that what I will be doing in these lectures is discussing philosophical history, and that this will sometimes involve discussion of certain religious themes. However, I'm not going to primarily be discussing Western religious thought. Religion will, in a sense, appear and disappear from the discussion. It's not because I don't think it's important or vital to understanding what's going on, but I just can't do everything in one course. At the same time, I think it's important to mention that philosophical presuppositions and religious belief often are linked together in important ways. Certainly when we talk about Buddhist thought or Brahmanistic thought, for example, much of the philosophical discussion has to do with ideas that are articulated in religion, somehow making sense of them, figuring out how these ideas can work together, trying to see if there's a kind of consistency there, even raising the question of what reason has to do with true insight altogether. These are some of the questions that are philosophical, even though they concern religion as well. Other turning points occurred because cultures came into contact with one another. I think one might even propose that there was a kind of second axial period of this nature in the 12th and 13th centuries. There were thinkers in many different societies who had learned of traditions elsewhere and were trying to somehow synthesize what they saw as insight from those traditions with traditions locally. So, for example, Chuxi in China was drawing on Buddhism, initially a foreign religion, as well as Taoism, a theory that was certainly fundamental to Chinese culture generally, in a new articulation of Confucianism. And one of the things that's fascinating about such a synthesis is there are many things that don't seem to add up very naturally between Confucianism and Taoism. Taoism was critical of Confucianism, and Buddhism seemed to be something that initially didn't fit with the Chinese way of looking at things at all. So working out some kind of synthesis that drew on these several traditions was one of Chuxi's goals. Dogen in Japan, the founder of the Soto school of Zen, similarly drew on multiple traditions in articulating a kind of Zen practice. He was drawing on Taoism, for example, as well as, of course, Buddhism as it had been imported from China, but at the same time, indigenous Japanese practices as well. Al-Sahrawardi, Persian philosopher, drew on several traditions in his articulation of what we can know of God. He describes God as the supreme light and describes the rest of creation as lesser lights that draw light from God. In the course of this, though, he was drawing on multiple traditions too. For example, the Zoroastrian tradition, the tradition founded by Zarathustra, even though that had been replaced, in a sense stamped out to a large extent, by Islam, which was the tradition that Al-Sahrawardi was writing in. He was also influenced by Neoplatonism, a school that drew on Plato and had been important in Christian thought as well. Thomas Aquinas, writing approximately the same time, was interested in synthesizing insights from the pagan ancient Greeks with Christian insights, and at the same time he drew on ideas that the Arabic thinkers had articulated. So in all these various ways, awareness of other cultures modified philosophical traditions from the inside. In a less agreeable way, the so-called Age of Discovery led to the collision of worldviews. And this, of course, brought philosophers from different points of view at least to recognize the fact of philosophical systems not their own. At first, some of these interactions were not very pleasant, and unfortunately, we still live today with the legacy of colonialism in many places. But in time, some of these confrontations have turned into something closer to an effort to communicate. So part of the purpose of this course is to try to bring some of these worldviews into connection with each other. I'm going to propose what our itinerary will be in order to give you some sense of where we're going to go from here. For the first several lectures, even though this is intended to be a course about world philosophy, I'm going to talk about Western thought. The main reason for doing this is that we need to start somewhere. And being a Western philosopher, I'm going to start with what I know best, Western thought. So the first lecture will concern Western metaphysics, the basic idea of what reality really is and what the relationship between appearance is to it. A second lecture will concern the Western approach to the human individual, in particular the idea of soul and body. A third lecture will focus on the whole idea of what our ethical ideals are. What is the good life? And how does this play out? What about us determines what the good life is? In particular, I'll be focusing on the role that reason plays in Western thought. Reason tends to be the adjudicator, something that we use to help us figure out the good life. From there, I'll compare Western thought to another society, particularly the Yoruba Society of Africa, and suggest that many assumptions that are basic to Western thought are not shared by the rest of the world. So there'll be several themes that we'll see as just probably taken for granted, indeed by many people that are brought up in the West, that aren't taken for granted in Yoruba culture at all. From there, I'll go on to explore the way that traditional beliefs, such as the beliefs of the Yoruba, interact with philosophical discussion in Africa today, and a similar problem or set of challenges that occurs in Latin America. Contemporary philosophers in both of these places are concerned with whether or not the philosophy that they're dealing with now has any relationship to their time and place, and whether traditional beliefs are a help or a hindrance in philosophical thinking. From there, we'll move to the North American continent and consider the worldview of the American Indians. Now, I must point out that obviously there are many different tribes of American Indians, and so what will be said in this lecture will be generalizations. But nevertheless, there are some generalizations that can be made and certain contrasts that can be pointed out with the standard Western philosophical worldview. From there, we'll move south and talk about Mesoamerica, the area of Mexico and Central America, and the tribe of the Aztecs in particular, and what they viewed as their responsibility owing to their conception of the world and how it came about. Again, we've got a parallel situation in Latin America to that of Africa. And so I'll move on to talk about more recent thought in Latin America and its various ways of grappling with its legacy, both of indigenous thought and of colonialism. At that point, we'll move across the world, in a sense almost axially, to the Indian subcontinent and spend the next several lectures discussing Indian thought. In particular, we'll focus initially on the whole idea that there's a supreme reality that fundamentally underlies everything. This is a very fundamental idea in Indian thought, but we'll move from understanding what that basic idea is to talking about different systems within Indian thought. In particular, I'll be contrasting the Sankhya system, actually a system that is a bit different from this basic idea, which has more or less taken hold of Indian thought generally, an earlier system that was dualistic. In other words, instead of saying there is a single reality, this system, as we'll see, claims that there are two kinds of reality, but that the distinction is absolutely vital to understand. We'll compare that again to the more recent Vedic thought, the thought of Indian philosophy that is sometimes called Hindu, although we'll be talking about it more in terms of Brahmanism, a certain Indian tradition. And we'll talk in particular at this point about a worldview called Advaita Vedanta that focuses on the reality of this supreme oneness underlying everything to such an extent that it claims that the world of our experience is really an illusion, not reality at all. From there, we'll move on to talk about the Bhagavad Gita, a fundamental statement of Indian ethical thought. We'll contrast that, to a certain extent, with the worldview offered by the Indian prince Siddhartha Gautama, who became known as the Buddha, and the Buddha's general plan for how to conquer suffering within the world. At this stage, we'll go on to trace the Buddhist tradition for a bit and consider the way that Buddhism divided into different schools that actually ended up making their homes in different parts of Asia. We'll conclude this part of our discussion of Buddhism with a consideration of the Indian Buddhist thinker Nagarjuna, who thought that philosophy had its place and indeed that it was valuable for many purposes, but that it should not be used to distract us from fundamental reality. Buddhism moves from India to China, but before talking about Chinese Buddhism, we go back in time a bit to talk about Chinese thought before Buddhism arrived. So we'll spend a lecture talking about just how the Chinese tend to think about reality, the fact that change rather than stasis or steady being is emphasized. At that point, we'll talk about two major traditions that have tremendous influence on Chinese thought: Confucianism on the one hand and Taoism on the other hand. I've already mentioned a little bit about the difference of opinion between the two. Given that background, we'll be in a position to understand how Buddhism arriving in China had to deal with a certain amount of culture shock and recognize ways in which Buddhism, as interpreted in China, built on traditional Chinese ideas. From there, we'll see Buddhism move to Japan, where again it developed a certain kind of Japanese style that drew on traditional ideas. And we'll conclude by noting some of the similarities and differences among these various cultures. Thank you.